The last communication was a simple sign-off, delivered with a kind of professional, chilling regularity. Good night, Malaysian 370.
That was at 17.19 UTC.
And then, just seconds later, a routine international flight, a huge Boeing 777 with 239 people on board, it just disappears from the radar screens of civilian air traffic control.
And that single moment initiated what has become, it's an 8-year-long search that hasn't just baffled investigators. It has completely redefined the boundaries of modern aviation mystery.
On March 8th, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished. It left behind this sort of technological ghost trail.
It's the perfect way to put it because all we have are these fragmentary forensic data points. And when you piece them together, they strongly suggest an intentional, a fatal journey deep into one of the most remote regions on the entire planet, the southern Indian Ocean.
The paradox at the heart of this is just profound, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We have hours and hours of highly technical scientific data, satellite pings, Doppler shifts, yet we still lack the one thing that matters most.
The exact physical location of the main wreckage.
We don't have it.
And that technological paradox, that's what we're here to unpack today. Yeah. We're going to do a deep dive into the crucial evidence, the physics of how it disappeared, the incredibly precise satellite forensics, and the deeply conflicting theories that continue to drive this relentless quest for closure.
We're going beyond the headlines, really. We're getting into the actual source material, the technical reports, the drift analyses, the digital signatures.
Because this is a story where understanding the acronyms BFO, BTO, ACARS, that's the key to unlocking the mystery.
Right. If you want these concise, investigative breakdowns of the world's most baffling stories, the ones where the technical details really matter, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We have to begin with the most crucial sequence, the timeline of the disappearance. Because every single second during this initial phase tells us something vital about the intent behind the plane's deviation.
Exactly. So MH370, a Boeing 777-200ER, departs Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. That's at 16.42 UTC.
And for the first half hour or so, everything is completely normal.
By all accounts, entirely uneventful. It's standard operating procedure. Everything is nominal. That is, until the aircraft approaches this critical juncture in the sky, a waypoint known as IGRI.
And IGRI is the transfer point, right? Where one country's air traffic control hands off to the next.
Precisely. It's where responsibility is supposed to shift from the Kuala Lumpur Area Control Center to Ho Chi Minh ACC in Vietnam. This transition of airspace is the exact moment everything changes.
The final voice sign-off. It came from the pilot in command at 17.19 and 30 seconds UTC.
And as you said, it was routine, professional, goodnight Malaysian 370.
But what happened less than 70 seconds after that is, for many, the single most damning piece of circumstantial evidence that suggests this wasn't an accident.
At 17.20 and 36 seconds UTC, the aircraft's transponder ceases transmitting. It just stops.
For the civilian world, the plane simply blinked out of existence.
It vanished from their screens. But we should explain exactly what the transponder is and why switching it off is such a massive red flag.
Please do, because I think for a lot of people, it just sounds like an antenna snapped or something.
Yeah.
But it's much more intentional than that.
Well, the transponder is the device that receives a signal from ground radar. We call it a secondary surveillance radar. And it automatically replies with the plane's unique code, its altitude, and its ground speed.
So it's constantly talking to the ground.
Constantly. When it's switched off, air traffic control just sees their target, their little blip, vanish instantly. And the investigation found that this sudden blackout wasn't likely due to a simple electrical fault.
And this happened right after another system went quiet too.
That's the other key. This, coupled with the prior cessation of the ACARS position reports, points directly to deliberate intervention.
Okay, let's define ACARS for everyone listening, because that's another critical piece of this forensic puzzle that often gets overlooked in the headlines.
Right. ACARS stands for Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. Think of it like the plane's administrative assistant. It automatically sends these short digital bursts of diagnostic and position data back to the airline's operations center.
So it's monitoring engine health, fuel burn, that kind of thing.
Everything. And the last ACARS position report had been transmitted about 13 minutes earlier at 17.07 UTC.
So let me get this straight. We have two different, highly redundant communication systems. ACARS for the airline and the transponder for air traffic control. And they both go dark within a 13-minute window of each other.
The likelihood of both those systems failing at the same time due to some kind of accident, especially on a modern, well-maintained 777, it's just astronomically low.
And crucially, the transponder can be switched off from the cockpit.
Yes. There is a physical mode selector in the cockpit, and it has a STBY, or standby position. Switching it to standby is a deliberate action by a pilot. This points very, very strongly toward an intent to hide the aircraft's position from all civilian tracking systems.
And the timing of it, happening less than 90 seconds after that calm, final good night. It's almost impossible to imagine that an external hijacker got into the cockpit in those few seconds.
It's hardly conceivable, no. If the systems were manually turned off, the fingers point squarely back to the cockpit crew.
That's the pivotal finding right there.
It is. However, while civilian radar lost the plane, military radar did not.
Because military radar works differently.
It does. It's called primary radar. It simply bounces signals off the airframe itself. It doesn't require any cooperation or transmission from the plane.
So the plane could be dark, but it's still a big metal object in the sky.
Exactly. And that military radar subsequently tracked a major, unmistakable deviation. A hard turn back, cutting right across peninsular Malaysia, followed by a trajectory that ultimately sent it toward the southern Indian Ocean.
The sheer audacity of that maneuver is staggering. To turn around and fly directly back over the country you just departed from.
It is astounding. The last known definitive position from the Butterworth military primary radar was at 18.01 UTC. And these sharp turns, this precise backtracking, these are maneuvers that investigators found exceedingly difficult to attribute to any kind of automated systems failure or catastrophic equipment malfunction.
This wasn't a plane flying aimlessly.
No. This reflects intelligent, deliberate control. These complex flight paths are maneuvers we associate with someone actively flying the aircraft.
So the civilian world lost the plane, the military confirmed the diversion. But even after all those primary systems were intentionally shut down, the aircraft still carried a sort of a hidden digital breadcrumb trail.
It did. And this is where we move into the hyper-technical realm of the satellite communications system, or SACOM. This is truly the most astonishing part of the whole investigation.
So the aircraft's SATCOM system, even though it wasn't sending flight data anymore, it was still talking to a satellite.
It was. The system, though seemingly silent after 17.07 UTC, was still in contact with the Inmarsat 3F1 satellite. Even when the plane isn't transmitting data, the system occasionally pings the satellite. It's a technical handshake just to confirm the communication link is still active.
And the first major event after the blackout was one of these handshakes.
A log-on, yes. The first major event post-disappearance was a completely unexpected handshake log-on at 18.25.27 UTC.
So that's about an hour after the transponder went dark.
An hour later and shortly after it had disappeared from military radar tracking. And this log-on told us something absolutely crucial.
Which was?
It confirmed that power had been restored to the satellite data unit, the SDU, after a period where power had been lost. This happened after the plane had already turned around and was heading southwest.
So someone turned it off and then turned it back on an hour later.
It seems so. And critically, this 18.25 log-on, it exhibited an abnormal measurement, something called the burst frequency offset, or BFO.
Okay, that sounds incredibly technical. Let's break down what BFO is and why that specific measurement is so important for proving an intentional shutdown.
So the BFO measures the difference between the frequency the satellite expects to receive and the frequency it actually gets. This difference is mostly caused by the Doppler effect, the relative movement of the aircraft.
Like an ambulance siren changing pitch as it passes you.
Exactly like that. But it's also affected by internal frequency drift within the plane's own system. And in this 18.25 log-on, the frequency offset was dramatically abnormal. It was way off.
And the experts were able to tie this abnormality directly to one very specific component, something called the OCXO.
The oven-controlled crystal oscillator. It's a tiny but vital part of the satellite data unit. Its job is to maintain a highly stable reference frequency for communications.
And it's oven-controlled because it needs to be kept warm to be stable.
Precisely. When the SDU is operating normally, the OCXO is kept warm and stable. However, if power is intentionally interrupted or lost, that crystal oscillator cools down. When you restore power, the OCXO has to warm up again, and during that warm-up period, its frequency drifts all over the place before it settles.
So Using an analogy, the 18.25 BFO offset wasn't like a car that had been running for hours and was still warm. It was like trying to start a car in the middle of a freezing winter where the engine sputters and the frequency just wobbles wildly as the system warms up.
That is a perfect analogy. That initial wild BFO offset strongly endorses the consensus belief. The 18.25 logon was preceded by a significant intentional power interruption. Someone or something turned the SDU completely off and then turned it back on about an hour later.
But if the plane was being flown on this hostile trajectory, why on earth turn the SACOM back on? Why not just leave it off?
That is one of the key questions. It's an area of speculation. Some theorize that the person in control may have needed to restore power to other essential systems linked to that same avionics bus, and the SATCOM unit just came back online as a result.
So it was an unintentional consequence of powering something else up?
That's one theory. Or, less likely, they may have simply forgotten to completely isolate the unit. But what's so important is that once the SATCOM was back on, it continued sending those periodic handshake signals, those pings, even though no actual flight data was being transmitted.
And this is what leads us to the final crucial communication hours and hours later.
That's right. The final successful SATCOM handshake occurred at 00.19.37 UTC. This seventh and final handshake is widely considered the technological death rattle of the aircraft.
And the analysis of this final ping strongly suggests that communication link was lost again shortly before this, likely because of a specific mechanical event.
Fuel exhaustion.
The plane just ran out of gas.
That's the consensus. The engines flamed out from lack of fuel, the main engine generators would have shut down, and then, briefly, something else provided power.
The APU.
Correct. The auxiliary power unit. It's essentially a small jet engine, usually in the tail cone, designed to provide electrical and pneumatic power on the ground, or, crucially, in an emergency like a double engine failure.
So the APU would have kicked on automatically.
The analysis indicates that yes, it kicked on briefly. The APU can start automatically if the main AC power is lost, and it draws fuel from the left main tank. Its generator powered the S8COM avionics just long enough to initiate that final brief log-on request before the APU itself likely ran out of fuel or failed.
So that timestamp, 00.19 UTC, that's extremely important because it fits the timeline for the plane's maximum endurance, doesn't it?
It fits perfectly. The time of this final transmission is entirely consistent with the maximum flight time you'd expect for a 777 carrying the fuel load of MH370. That's based on the fuel remaining during the last ACARS transmission back at 17.07 UTC.
So it's highly likely the aircraft flew right to the very edge of its range, airborne for over 7 hours, executing this calculated, deliberate flight path.
Yes. And those satellite data points, the BFO we talked about, and another one called the burst timing offset, or BTO, are what ultimately constrained that massive search area to the infamous narrow seventh arc.
So BFO gives us the direction. What does BTO give us?
BTO gives us distance. It measures the time it takes for the signal to make a round trip from the satellite to the aircraft and back again. Because the speed of light is a constant, that timing measurement provides a highly accurate estimate of the range, or distance.
So it defines a perfect arc on the surface of the Earth where the plane must have been at the time of that ping.
Exactly. The BTO gives us distance, defining the arc. But the BFO, by measuring that Doppler shift, adds the crucial speed and direction component. If the plane is flying toward the satellite, the BFO value is positive. If it's flying away, it's negative.
So you combine the two.
You combine the precise distance data from the BTO with the movement data from the BFO across several hours of pings, and you can effectively constrain the possible trajectory and the final location to that narrow line in the southern Indian Ocean we call the seventh arc.
That's just amazing. A simple handshake log file becomes this incredibly precise forensic tool.
It's a testament to the engineers who figured it out.
Now, despite all of this incredible technology, the wreckage remains elusive. Let's move on to the limited physical evidence we do have, because the analysis of these fragments is just as important as all the satellite math.
To date, as you said, the main wreckage has never been located. The only confirmed physical evidence comes from debris that washed ashore thousands and thousands of miles away, mostly along the southeastern African coast.
Which required extensive drift modeling to trace back to a probable origin point.
Right, and people ask how reliable is that? They use these very sophisticated computer models that account for wind, ocean currents, the buoyancy of a specific aircraft part.
So a flaperon would drift differently than, say, a piece of the cabin interior.
Exactly. And when you input the time the plane is believed to have crashed, The models can accurately predict the probability paths for floating debris. The discovery of that debris along the African coast and on islands like Reunion was entirely consistent with those models, which helped confirm the general crash region.
What were the key confirmed pieces, the ones that definitively linked the debris to MH370?
The first and most iconic piece was the right flaperon found on Reunion Island in July 2015.
And this was confirmed not just by being the right part type, but by actual records.
Yes, by maintenance records and specific stencil numbers that were unique to the aircraft that was operating as MH370. Additionally, we have sections of the right and left outboard flaps, which are critical control surfaces on the wing found in Tanzania and Mauritius.
So those three pieces are 100% confirmed. I remember reports mentioned several other pieces, though.
That's right. While only those three have been forensically confirmed, there are about 7 other pieces that are considered highly probable or almost certain to be from MH370. They just lacked the specific stencils or serial numbers for that definitive match.
And what kind of parts were those?
Things like portions of an engine cowling and some cabin interior panels found across South Africa and Madagascar. They match a 777, and the drift models say they could have come from the trash site.
Now, the detailed analysis of the main confirmed fragments, the flaperon and the flaps, this has been absolutely critical because it offers some conflicting clues about the final moments of the flight.
It really does. It introduces the core technical tension of the entire investigation. Detailed analysis of the flaperon, in particular, suggests that it was likely in a retracted or neutral position when it separated from the wing.
And this is based on the damage patterns.
Exactly. The damage observed on the leading edge was consistent with contact between an auxiliary support track and the flap, but only when the flap was fully inserted, meaning retracted.
And that is a crucial finding. Because if the flaps were retracted, that actively challenges the idea of a pilot attempting a controlled, planned ditching into the ocean.
Absolutely. In any controlled ditching scenario where a pilot is conscious and trying to make a survivable water landing, they would deploy the flap fully.
Why is that?
Deploying flaps dramatically increases the wing's lift and lowers the aircraft's stall speed. It lets you fly slower, and it allows for a slower, softer impact, which maximizes the chances of survival for everyone on board.
So the evidence of retracted flaps suggests something very different.
It suggests a much more violent, high-energy impact, or possibly a catastrophic structural failure, something called a flutter event, as the aircraft descended very rapidly.
So it sounds like the plane was guided for 7 hours by someone, and then it just crashed violently and uncontrollably, maybe on autopilot until the end. That's a brutal conclusion to draw.
It aligns much better with the uncontrolled impact after fuel exhaustion theory. If the plane ran out of fuel, the engines quit, the autopilot would disengage, and the plane would enter a spiral dive or a high-speed descent, leading to a violent, uncontrolled impact with the water.
And the kind of violent end would explain why the flaps were retracted and why the wreckage would be so pulverized, so hard to find.
That's the logic, yes. It brings us directly to the question of control. If the flight was guided for hours, who was the guide?
And that means we have to turn to the deeply conflicting theories about who guided it and where it finally ended up. The first, and certainly the most enduring theory, is pilot involvement, an act of murder-suicide aimed at concealing the evidence.
The circumstantial evidence supporting this theory is, well, it's significant. You have the intentional manipulation of the transponder and ACARS exactly at that handover point, which indicates a very high level of situational awareness.
You'd have to know exactly when to do it to cause the most confusion.
Exactly. Then you have the deliberate repowering of the SU 1 hour later after the plane had already deviated significantly. All of this points to a conscious, highly trained individual in the cockpit.
And there was also that detail about the home flight simulator.
The home flight simulator, yes. This needs to be unpacked carefully. The Royal Malaysia Police Forensic Report documented their analysis of the piloting command's home simulator hard drives.
And what did they find?
Out of more than 2,700 coordinates they retrieved, there were 7 specific manually programmed waypoint coordinates that, when you connect them, they simulate a flight path deep into the southern Indian Ocean.
That sounds like a smoking gun. A direct match?
It is chillingly close. It simulated a trajectory that ended with fuel exhaustion and ditching in the southern Indian Ocean, precisely in the same remote region where the BTO and BFO data pointed the real flight.
But I remember there was some controversy around this.
Yeah.
The FBI initially said they found nothing suspicious.
The context is everything there. The FBI's initial report said nothing suspicious, because the hard drive also contained lots of other simulated routes to various destinations. You know, it's not illegal for pilots to simulate dangerous flights. That's part of how they train for emergencies.
But the specificity of this one route is what's so compelling.
The precision of it, yes. That it so closely mirrored the flight path that the satellite data independently confirmed. That's what elevated its significance so dramatically for many investigators. It's just too much of a coincidence for them to ignore.
Okay, so if we accept for a moment the possibility of a controlled, murderous flight, that brings us right back to that central contradiction. The flaps were retracted, which suggests an uncontrolled end. If the pilot was in control for 7 hours, why wouldn't he attempt to smooth ditching?
That is the investigative fault line. Proponents of the pilot suicide theory have a couple of answers. First, that the pilot may have intended to conceal the plane entirely. He deliberately flew until fuel exhaustion caused an uncontrolled crash, ensuring the plane fragmented on impact, making it much harder to find.
So a violent crash was the goal.
That's the theory. The second argument is a bit more technical. It suggests that the BFO discrepancies in the final moments, especially around the 6th and 7th arcs, are actually better explained by an uncontrolled descent combined with that technical frequency drift we talked about.
So the physical evidence of a violent end serves two conflicting theories at the same time.
Precisely. It could be the intended outcome of a suicide pilot who wanted to conceal the wreckage, or it could be the inevitable result of a total system failure after the pilot became incapacitated much earlier in the flight, with the plane just flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel.
And it's this total lack of reconciliation that fuels the most controversial segment of the ongoing search, taking us far away from the official 7th arc.
Yes, now we're talking about the highly disputed Weak Signal Propagation Reporter data, or WSPR.
This is where we leave the realm of consensus satellite data and enter some really novel, almost experimental technological territory.
We do. WSPR technology, championed by independent researchers like Richard Godfrey, attempts to use reflections and perturbations of amateur radio waves. It's essentially a form of passive radar to reconstruct the aircraft's path.
And if they're correct, the entire multi-million-dollar search has been focused on the wrong location.
That is the claim, yes. The WSPR tracking suggests a radically different and highly specific crash zone much further north than the conventional 7th arc search area. They've centered it at 29.128 degrees S, 99.934 degrees E, an area defined by a circle with only a 30-kilometer radius.
An incredibly precise location, if true. So why is this theory met with so much skepticism by official investigative bodies?
The technical objections are substantial. WSPR relies on detecting how a large metallic object, the aircraft, perturbs a radio signal between two amateur radio stations. Critics argue that the scattered signal bouncing off the plane is many, many orders of magnitude smaller than the direct signal between the two ham radio stations.
So it's like trying to hear a whisper in a hurricane.
A good way to put it. They claim such a small perturbation shouldn't really affect the measurement, and that any perceived changes are far more likely to be influenced by external atmospheric factors, things like dynamic shifts in the ionosphere or multipath interference.
So the atmosphere itself could create a signal that looks like a passing plane.
It could easily mimic it, yes. For a multi-million-dollar search to rely on WSPR, the methodology has to be verifiable and repeatable. And many experts argue that WSPR just doesn't meet that standard of rigorous, peer-reviewed science that would be necessary to overturn the hard BTO data, which is based on direct communication between the plane and the satellite.
So it's a brilliant example of technical creativity, but the consensus remains with the Inmarsat data.
It does. The BTO data is solid. It's a direct measurement of distance. The BFO is also generally reliable. WSPR remains highly speculative, despite the enthusiasm of its proponents.
And that's why, regardless of these conflicting theories, the Malaysian government has agreed to a renewed official search effort, and they're going back to the original area.
Yes. In late 2023 and early 2024, the government formally agreed, in principle, to a new search with the private exploration firm Ocean Infinity.
They're the company that searched the area back in 2018. Why go back to a place that's already been scanned twice? Is this an admission that the first searches weren't thorough enough?
It's more an admission of the technical imperfections and the sheer difficulty of the task. This new operation will focus again on rescanning the area between 33 degrees S and 36 degrees along the 7th arc. And the incentive is significant.
This is the no find, no fee deal, right?
Exactly. It's a strictly defined arrangement. If they're successful and find the wreckage, Ocean Infinity stands to gain a huge payment. Reports suggest up to $70 million.
So what makes this search different? Better technology.
Better technology, but also a better strategy. The main goal is to compensate for known weaknesses in the prior scans. They're going to significantly expand the search with up to 45 nautical miles on either side of that 7th arc line.
So they're casting a much wider net.
A much wider net. The previous searches were constrained by funding and focused very narrowly on the arc itself. This new width accounts for potential errors in the beta ABFO modeling, and crucially, it allows them to fill in areas that were searched before but gave them low quality or missing data.
And that's because the underwater terrain in this region is just notoriously treacherous.
It's some of the worst on the planet. The southern Indian Ocean floor is characterized by steep trenches, massive undersea mountains. It's extremely rough. The previous searches often struggled with their side scan sonar in areas with steep slopes. This renewed focus will exhaust all the areas that the consensus technical groups identified as hotspots but were previously missed or poorly covered.
So they're basically exhausting the most probable area before they would ever consider chasing the more speculative WSBR location.
That's the logical path, yes.
So here we are, years later. We have this detailed forensic timeline built from digital breadcrumbs. We know the plane flew for over 7 hours, likely until it ran out of fuel. We have physical evidence suggesting a high-energy, uncontrolled impact. And we have these competing theories pointing fingers at either a malicious crew or some undetected technical anomaly that let the plane fly on as a ghost for hours.
And that is exactly why the mystery of MH370 is so persistent. It's compounded by that profound technological paradox. We know the final segment of the flight was calculated and long, based on physics and satellite constraints, yet we still can't reconcile that data with the physical evidence of the flaps or pinpoint the crash site. The evidence points overwhelmingly to the human element, the deliberate manipulation of systems. But the physical proof is 4,000 meters underwater, missing.
The inability to determine the true cause of the disappearance, whether it was technical failure or a deliberate malicious act. That's why this remains the world's most haunting aviation puzzle. The search continues, driven by the belief that finding the main wreckage will finally bring the definitive answers.
But, even if they find the black boxes, the question of why might still be elusive. If the pilot was responsible, he took that answer with him. But I think the larger point is, in a technological epoch where global flight tracking is now mandatory for commercial aircraft, the fact that an entire modern 777 can simply vanish remains unacceptable. The pursuit of MH370 is now less about just this one search and more about global aviation proving it can live up to the promise of always knowing where its planes are.
It's the ultimate failure of redundancy, all wrapped in an awful human tragedy. A really sobering thought to end on. We thank you for diving deep into the forensics with us.
And for more forensic analysis of history's great unknowns, please subscribe to The Deep Dive.